Our next speaker is Nick Cooney. He is the founder and director of the Humane League, an animal advocacy organization based in Philadelphia that focuses on farm animal protection issues. In his presentation, Nick will elaborate on what techniques are the most successful in persuading people to move toward vegan eating. Welcome, Nick.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out to this talk. I have a quick question. Does anyone here know how many vegans it takes to change a light bulb? 2. 1 to change the light bulb and 1 to check for animal ingredients. Ooh, tough crowd over here in Europe. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the science of animal advocacy. So what exactly does that mean? Well, to start, I want to go back in time over 2,000 years to around the year 300 BC. It was around that time that the practice that we now know as alchemy first got its start. Now, if we think of alchemy today, we probably picture strange old men trying to turn lead into gold, and indeed that was one of the goals of the alchemists. And we can look back today and we can think that what they did was pretty foolish. But in their time, alchemists were taken very seriously. There were schools you could go to learn alchemy. There were government-sanctioned alchemists in a number of countries here in Europe. There were textbooks on it. And alchemy was around for about over 2,000 years. It was around until the 1700s and 1800s. And it was at that time that alchemy basically disappeared, and it was replaced by chemistry. You may have noticed the names have a little something in common. And whereas alchemy was basically a 200-year exercise in futility, 2,000 years that accomplished basically nothing, chemistry, in the few hundred years it's been around, has achieved things that are very helpful for extending and improving human life. For example, if you enjoy having access to life-saving medicine, if you enjoy wasting time on your smartphone, if you enjoy having fresh, clean drinking water coming out of your faucet every morning, and if you enjoy getting to ride around in the car with your friends, you can thank chemistry, at least in part, for all of these things. Now, what is the difference between chemistry and alchemy? Why did one succeed where the other was such a massive failure? And most importantly of all, why am I standing up here at an animal rights conference talking about chemistry and alchemy? So the difference between the two, between chemistry and alchemy, is a very simple one, but it's also a very fundamental and important one. And it's a difference that probably all of us learned back in grade school. And that difference is the scientific method. So chemists did use the scientific method. Alchemists did not. Now, for those of us who haven't been in grade school for a while, the scientific method is basically all about testing. So if you want to assert that something is true, you better be able to do the testing to show that it is, in fact, true. And if we look up the definition of the word science in Wikipedia, we see that testing is really what science is all about. So if you look up science in Wikipedia, the first sentence will tell you that science builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions. So it is the scientific method, it is testing, that helped chemistry advance step by step out of the murky depths of alchemy. And it is testing which allows any scientific endeavor to advance to greater understanding and greater effectiveness. Now, this is something that's probably pretty easy for us to understand when it comes to the hard sciences, things like chemistry and biology and math, but testing and research and data are being used by all sorts of disciplines in our society. For example, in the United States, where I come from, last year, President Obama was reelected. It was a very tough re-election because the US economy was the worst it had been in maybe 70, 80 years. There's, of course, a lot of racism in the United States working against him. And so why is it that he won? Well, certainly there are a number of reasons. But one reason that prominent US newspapers like the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times reported on in the weeks following the election, one of the secrets to his victory was his use of research and testing and data. He hired a team of 50 data analysts whose job it was to analyze, to try to figure out who the undecided voters were in the US and what messages and what approaches would be most likely to get them to vote for Obama. And again, papers like the New York Times, the LA Times, credited that use of data and research and testing with his victory in the presidential election. In the world of business, research and testing is used all the time as well, to answer questions like who to advertise to, what sort of advertising to use, what products to sell, what features to have, things of that nature. Companies spend literally tens of billions of dollars every year on market research because they know that that research, that testing is what's going to help them succeed as a business. Now, some of these same principles are starting to be used in the nonprofit world as well. To give just one example of that, one very important human health issue right now is the fight against malaria, a disease that still kills millions of people every year. But different anti-malaria organizations took different approaches. For example, when it came to these mosquito nets that help prevent the spread of malaria by keeping mosquitoes away while you sleep, some anti-malaria organizations were giving the nets away for free. Some were charging a very small price under the idea that if somebody paid for it, even if it was 60 cents, that they were now invested in it and they would be more likely to use the nets, and therefore that would help prevent the spread of malaria more effectively. But which approach was more effective? Which approach would save more human lives? Well, some researchers decided, you know what, rather than guessing or making assumptions or working off of philosophies, let's just put it to the test and find out. And so they did that, and they found that, lo and behold, the free nets worked better, saved more lives than charging a small price. And so now, through the simple use of testing, of the scientific method, these organizations are able to save many more human lives. Now, we, of course, are here not to talk about saving human lives, really, but to talk about saving animal lives, preventing animal suffering, and so forth. Can these same tools, can the same approach that's used in the hard sciences, in politics, in business, elsewhere in the nonprofit world, can the same approach, can the use of research and data and testing, can also be used to help the plight of farm animals and to help us bring the world closer to what we all would like to see? That is basically what I'm going to talk about today. If we think about the plight of farm animals, and if we think about the work that all of us in here and all of our groups are working on, pretty much everything we are striving to achieve for farm animals, we're striving to achieve through one single means, and that is through changing human behavior. So whether it's getting members of the public to go vegan, whether it's getting politicians to vote a certain way, whether it's getting companies to change their policies and getting CEOs to institute new policies, all of these require changing human behavior. Now, when it comes to succeeding at changing human behavior, there's some things that we as a movement sometimes tell ourselves that feel good, that sound good, but that aren't exactly true. For example, sometimes we tell ourselves that we'll succeed as an animal rights movement, we'll succeed because we're on the side of compassion. We tell ourselves that we will succeed because we really, really care about animals. Or we might tell ourselves that our movement will succeed if we just work really hard day in and day out. Now, every one of these things, being on the side of compassion and justice, caring about the cause, working hard, every one of these things will make us more likely to succeed. But they alone will not guarantee success. If we look around the world, and if we look back through history, we can see, unfortunately, that time and time again, those who are on the side of justice, on the side of compassion, did not win. Those things are important, they're helpful, but they're not sufficient for us to win and bring about the world that we want to see for animals. We will succeed at changing behavior and saving animals if we learn what really motivates people to change their beliefs, to change their ethics, and most importantly, to change their behaviors. And so psychology research is really a roadmap of how to change behavior. And just as we wouldn't get into our car and drive to Luxembourg without first getting the directions on how to get from our home to here, or at least plugging in the GPS and putting in where we're going, it would also be naive of us to think that any one of us automatically knows how to inspire members of the public to start caring about animals and to move towards being vegan. We as a movement, we really have two choices. So just as the alchemists believed that they could turn lead into gold, even though there was no testing, there was no data to show that that was true, we can continue to assume that our assumptions about what's going to work to change behavior and bring about the world we want to see, we can just continue to assume that our assumptions are correct, or like the chemists, we can insert the scientific method, we can insert research and testing into the great work we are already doing to become even more effective, spare even more animals, and bring us more quickly to that world that we want to see. One of the reasons that testing and research and looking to the research is so important is that our assumptions about what motivates people to change are often incorrect. So let me give you one example about this. I'm going to be citing a number of studies today. Some of them are not from the field of animal advocacy specifically, but the results are all very applicable to the work that we do. So in this particular study, environmental researchers wanted to see how they could get homeowners to reduce the amount of energy they were using in their homes. So they created 4 different brochures that spoke about reasons to conserve energy. The first booklet spoke about the environmental reasons to conserve. The second spoke about the financial savings. The third spoke about the benefits to the community. And the fourth simply said that most people in that town were already conserving energy. So researchers went around to homes in this one town, and they put just one leaflet under each door. They then worked with the local utility company to monitor the actual energy usage in these homes over the next 3 months. And of all 4 of these, there was only one booklet that inspired people to use less energy. So I want to take a little poll here. Who thinks it was the first one, the one with the environmental message, that was most effective? Who would say the second one, the one about saving money? All right, about half. Who would say the third one, the one about benefits to the community? And who would say the fourth one, the one that said other people are doing it? Or about the other half? Well, it turned out that of all 4 of these booklets, the one that worked was indeed the fourth one. In fact, it was only the booklet that said other people were conserving energy that reduced home energy usage at all. Now, if I was running an environmental organization in this town, I would automatically assume that, of course, I'm an environmentalist, therefore I should use the environmental message, and that's going to work best. Or maybe I would try to appeal to people's self-interest and talk about the financial savings. The point is that our assumptions about what motivates people to change their behaviors and their attitudes and their beliefs are often incorrect. Our assumptions are often incorrect. So rather than rely on philosophy or assumptions or guesses, when it comes to saving the lives of animals, when it comes to sparing their suffering, when it comes to bringing about that world and that mindset we want to see in the world, rather than rely on those other things, we need to just look to what works. We need to look to the research on what works, the science on what works. Right? Now, thankfully for us, there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of peer-reviewed studies that show what does work and what doesn't work for inspiring people to change their attitudes and ethics and to change their behaviors. Now, perhaps for some of you, the idea of sitting down and reading through thousands of academic studies sounds like a fun time. Right? But imagine for most of us, that idea is a little bit scary. But no need to worry. I tried to do a lot of this reading for us and compile it into 2 books. The first one came out a couple years ago. It's called Change of Heart, What Psychology Can Teach Us About Spreading Social Change. And that looks at the literature in general, and in general what works for changing attitudes and behaviors. I'll also have a new book that just came out, an ebook, and the print book will be out in a few months, called Veganomics, which looks at all the research specific to vegetarians and vegans, why people change, why they don't, so on and so forth. So what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of my time today is I'm going to be highlighting what I think are some of the most important points from that research, some of the points that will make all of us most effective at promoting vegan eating. And my talk's going to be specific to vegan eating and promoting veganism, but the research and the tools are applicable really to any type of animal advocacy work. All right, so to get started, the first section is going to be about persuading others. As we talked about earlier, if we want to achieve change for animals, it pretty much is going to come down to inspiring people to change the behavior, to change your attitudes, but again, most importantly, change the behavior. So what tools can we use to be more effective at inspiring people to move towards vegan eating? So the first point, use of stories versus the use of statistics. If we are talking to a friend, a family member, a member of the public about vegan eating and the plight of farm animals, there's 3 different approaches we could take. We could tell a story about an individual animal. We could talk about how big the problem is and how many animals are suffering, or we could do both. But which one of these is going to be most effective at inspiring people to care about animals and change their diet? Right? Well, some researchers wanted to put this type of question to the test. Now, they were not animal rights activists, so the issue they looked at was another very serious issue, and that is starvation in Africa. So they created 3 fundraising letters. The first one spoke about how big the problem was. So it gave stats on the number of tens of millions of people facing starvation in Africa each year. The second letter didn't have any of that. It only had the story of one young African girl and what life was like for her as a child facing starvation. And the third letter had both. It had the statistics about how many people were suffering and how big the problem was, but it also had that story of the young girl and what life was like for her. So they sent out these letters, donations came back, and at the end of the day, which of these would you guess was most effective at getting people to care, getting people to donate, and therefore saving lives from starvation? Who would say the first one, the one that had the stats? Who would say the second one, the one that had the story? Who would say the third one, the one that had both? Again, we have about a split here between number 2 and number 3. And so it turned out that the most effective letter was the second one. In fact, the letter that had only the story generated about twice as much in donations, in other words, went twice as far to saving human lives, as either of the other 2 letters. And the letter that had both the story and the stats did only slightly better than the letter that had the statistics only. Stories are very powerful. They're emotionally powerful. They inspire us to behavior change, to attitude change as well. One other example of this from the research. There was a university researcher in the United States who he was a professor, and he had all of his students design and give a talk about a subject of their own choice. After the talk was over, he polled the students in the class to see what they remembered from one another's presentations. And what he found is that of the facts, of the statistics that had been presented that day, only 5% were remembered by the rest of the class just a half hour later. But of the stories that had been given that day, a full 60% were remembered by the rest of the class. So stories, not only do they have emotional weight, but they are sticky. We remember them, they influence us, they get us to care, they get us to act. So what this means for us as animal advocates and as advocates of vegan eating is that we need to use stories more often. So rather than talk about the fact that there are tens of billions of animals killed for food and hundreds of millions of male chicks ground up alive by the egg industry, we need to focus on individual stories. We need to tell the story of an individual animal and what life is like for him or her on a day-to-day basis on one of these factory farms. The more we use these stories, the more effective we'll be at getting people to care and getting them to change their diet and therefore save animals. Next tool I want to talk about is foot in the door. And probably many of you can guess what that is all about, but I'm going to give one example from the research that's going to make clear right away what foot in the door is all about. So there were some researchers in California in the US who went around to homes in a particular neighborhood, knocked on doors, and they brought with them these kind of ugly yard signs that said, "Drive safely." Now, because the yard signs were pretty ugly, when they asked homeowners if they would put up these yard signs out in their front yard, only about 17% of homeowners agreed to and did put out the yard signs. So, kind of a failure. Researchers then went to other homes in the same neighborhood, but this time they left the yard signs at home. They knocked on doors, but this time they had little window stickers, 3-inch or maybe 5 centimeter by 5 centimeter or so window stickers that also said, "Please drive safely." Knocked on doors, said, "Hey, we're promoting safe driving. We wondered if you would put up these stickers." And this time, because it was such an easy thing to do, to put that sticker up in your window, virtually everyone agreed to and did put up the stickers. 3 weeks later, researchers went back to the same homes that got the stickers. But this time, they brought with them those ugly yard signs. Knocked on doors, said, "Hey, it's me again. Thanks so much for putting up those stickers. And now I wondered if you would put this yard sign out in your front yard." And this time, not 17%, but almost 70% agreed to and did put the yard signs out in the front yards. So the bottom line is this. Even though the main goal of researchers was to get the yard signs out in the front yard, they were much more effective at doing so by first making a similar but smaller request that people were likely to say yes to, and then later going back and making their second, real, larger request. This is what foot in the door is all about. And there have been literally over 1,000 studies documenting the power of foot in the door. Just 2 other ones really quickly. Another study found that asking people to sign a petition supporting the building of a recreation center for the physically handicapped. Later donated, the next week, donated twice as much money to build that center as people who were never asked to sign the petition. Similarly, people who were asked to wear a pin promoting the Canadian Cancer Society, the next week when they were asked to donate, again donated about twice as much money as people who were never even asked to wear the pin. So again, there's been literally over 1,000 studies documenting the power of this. And the reason that researchers think Foot in the Door works so well is because it influences our sense of self-identity. So once I put on that pin, once I put up that window sticker, once I sign that petition, I now am starting to see myself as a sort of person who cares about promoting safe driving or any of these other things. And therefore, when someone comes back and encourages me to do something else, something larger, because I already feel like, yeah, I'm the sort of person who cares about promoting safe driving, so sure, I'll put up that yard sign. That is why Foot in the Door research is so powerful. So what does this mean for us as animal advocates and as advocates of veganism specifically? Well, one concern that some in the movement have is that there's a concern with programs like Meatless Mondays, or even encouraging people to cut back on meat, or even encouraging people to go vegetarian. And the concern is an understandable one. The concern is that, of course we want a vegan world, and we want everyone to be vegan. And so if we encourage people to do anything less than that, whether it's meatless on Monday, go vegetarian, yes, they may do that thing. They may go meatless on Monday. They may go vegetarian. But then they'll become complacent. They'll stop there, and they won't ultimately go on to adopt the beliefs and the behaviors we want them to have, which is, of course, the animal rights mentality and a vegan lifestyle. Well, thankfully, what Foot in the Door research shows us is that we don't have to have that concern. Fortunately, we don't have to have that concern. People who make a small change become more likely to make a larger change down the line. And there's other studies in the US and Europe as well that have shown this as well. People who have reduced their meat consumption, people who have gone vegetarian in surveys have shown that they are much more interested than the general public to go vegan and more likely to end up going vegan down the line. And that kind of brings us to my next point, which is the best request. What is the best request that we can make of our audience to get them to change the behavior as much as possible and thereby do as much good possible for the world? We all want the most we can get out of life, right? We want to have the most fun, we want to have the most success, and we want the world to change as much as possible in a direction that helps animals, that saves lives, that reduces suffering, and so forth. Well, some researchers wanted to see, scientifically, again, how can a speaker get the most from his or her audience? So for example, if I used to do a lot of humane education, where I would go to high schools and talk about factory farming and vegan eating and so forth. Now, as a speaker, going into kind of a general high school class, what request should I make of these students? In my ideal world, what I would really like every one of those students to do is go vegan, become a full-time animal rights activist, only eat organic food, not drive a car, not have kids, do probably lots of other things, right? That's ideally what I want every student to do. But if I go in and I tell them exactly what I want and exactly what I think ethically they should do, they'll look at me like I'm insane, and they probably won't do anything at all. On the other hand, maybe I could go in and make a very small request, something really easy for them to do, like, maybe just have, one vegan meal a month, or, something like really basic. Which of these is going to accomplish more good? Is it better to ask for everything we want? Is it better to ask for something very small and easy? Or is it better for us to ask for something in the middle? What is going to create the most behavior change? Let me do one more poll here. Who would say the easy, small request will create the most behavior change? A lot of people. Who would say the medium request will create the most behavior change? And who would say the large request will create the most behavior change? All right, so of course, what small, medium, and large kind of varies, so, no one's like exactly correct or incorrect here, but what researchers found is this. They found that the most effective request to make of your audience is kind of in that middle range. But basically what it is that we should encourage our audience to make a change that is significant, but that they could probably picture themselves doing it. If it's a really easy thing to do, then sure, people may do it, but it won't accomplish a lot of good. If it's a really big change, too big that most people cannot picture themselves doing it, almost no one is going to make that change. So the sweet spot, the area that's going to create the most change is, again, encouraging people to do something that is significant, but that they can picture themselves doing. So now, what does this mean when it comes to farm animals? If we're promoting vegan eating, what kind of message is going to allow animals, more animals anyway, to sleep soundly at night knowing they're going to be free from exploitation? Well, this is the area where it kind of gets into, at this point anyway, until more research is done, it gets into the area of guesses and assumptions based on that data. But what I assume based on that research and that data and everything I've seen so far is that most of the public cannot picture themselves, right now, cannot picture themselves as vegans. Some, especially in some countries, could picture themselves as vegetarians, especially teenagers and college students. And everyone could picture themselves, pretty much everyone, could picture themselves eating less meat. So my guess, based on this research, is that the most effective message, the one that will create the most behavior change and therefore spare the most animals, is a request in the vein of cutting back meat consumption to going vegetarian. For certain audiences, certainly we would encourage them to go vegan, especially for any audiences that are already vegetarian. But I think for the general public, if we think about this research, it's that message in the range of reduction to vegetarianism that not only will create the most behavior change now and spare the most animals now, but if we think back to foot in the door and how that works, it also means we'll create more vegans in the long run as well. Studies in both the US and Europe show not only do the majority of the public think that vegan eating is not something they have any interest in doing and not something they see as positive, but one recent study from this year, in the US at least, found that even the majority of vegetarians think that veganism is too restrictive and is not healthy. Right? So even though this seems odd, and even though it may make us feel uncomfortable inside because we're not expressing exactly what we believe and not expressing exactly what we want, it seems likely from the research that encouraging something less than veganism is what's going to create the most vegans in the long term and what's going to help the most animals in both the short and the long term. One other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about advocating diet change is that when it comes to the different farm animals that are eaten, they suffer in different quantities. So this pie chart is specific to the average American meat consumer, so it may be a bit different for every country that you are from. But at least in the United States, this is how much farm animal suffering is caused by the average American meat eater. It's over 2,000 days of suffering, just horrible, of course. But we can see that the vast majority of the suffering is caused by farm-raised fish and by chickens, either chickens raised for eggs or chickens raised for their meat. And so one thing this means, one thing we can take from this, is that if we're encouraging someone to change their diet and they're not willing to go vegan, they're not willing to go vegetarian, maybe one thing we could encourage them to do to start is just cut out chicken. Because just by doing that, they could prevent almost half of the suffering they are causing. If they cut out chicken and fish, which is something that I think a lot of people would be more open to doing, they could spare over 90% of the suffering and the cruelty and the deaths that they're causing. Obviously, that's not ultimately what we want veganism, but for people not willing to make those larger changes, this might be a good, smaller request to get them moving to start. All right, moving on. Social norms. We all like to think of ourselves as these independent spirits, right? We think of ourselves as these intelligent people who have the decisions we have, who do the behaviors we carry out, and who have the opinions we hold because we've thought about them and we've decided, this is who I am, this is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to do. But the reality is that all of us, including all of us in this room today, in the end, we're really just very similar to everyone else, right? We're similar to and we're influenced by either the public in general or at least other people in our social and peer group. And one thing this means is that messages about social norms, in other words, messages that say a lot of people are doing this thing, are very powerful at shaping what we believe and what we do, right? We saw that earlier in the study about home energy usage. And there are dozens and dozens of studies showing the exact same thing. Let me give you just one other example from the research. There was a hotel chain that wanted their guests to start reusing bath towels. Now, their main reason for doing this was financial, because if people reused the towels each night instead of turning them in to go through the laundry, it would save money and it would save time. They wouldn't have to do all the wash, they wouldn't have to do all the drying, they wouldn't need to hire more staff to take care of it. So they put out little signs around the hotel, but of course, this would also be good for the environment. So they put out little signs around the hotel that said, to help us protect the environment, we encourage you to please reuse your bath towels. And you know what? The signs worked. Some people started reusing their bath towels. But researchers came in and they thought they could do a little bit of a better job. So they took out the old signs and they put in new ones that said just one sentence, And that was, most guests in this hotel reused their bath towels. Said nothing about the environment at all. But switching from the environmental to the social norms message increased towel reuse by about 25%. And when the signs were made even more specific, so they said most guests in room 309, or whatever room it was, reused their bath towels, towel reuse increased even further. Now, of course, we care about animals. We want to promote an ethic of compassion for animals, equality for animals, and so forth. So of course, when we're promoting vegan eating, we want to talk about the suffering of animals, how it's not right, how we should not support it. But if in addition to that, we also add in a social norms component to our message, we'll be more effective at inspiring people to care and inspire them to change their attitudes and change the behaviors in the way we would like them to change. So for example, talking about celebrities that have gone vegan or vegetarian, talking about the growing number of vegans and vegetarians and meat reducers, talking about the growing availability of vegan food in restaurants and grocery stores. The more we do these things, the more we show that vegan eating is a growing trend, a popular trend, something that lots of people are doing, the more effective we will be at getting other people to do the same themselves and to think that it is a good and ethical thing to do. Next, be like them. One of the consequences of social norms and the fact that we're influenced by other people is this. The research shows that we're much more likely to be influenced and persuaded by someone who is similar to us. So studies have shown that when we are similar to our audience in terms of things like age and gender and the way we dress, in our political beliefs, in our social beliefs, even in our body language and our manner of speaking. The more similar we are to our audience in any of these areas, the more likely they will be to listen to us, to be persuaded by us, and to make the changes we would like them to make. So what does that mean for us as animal advocates? Well, I think that one thing that it means is that if we want to be as effective as possible, we need to some extent be able to adapt ourselves to our audience. So if we are doing vegan outreach at a punk concert, we probably want to look one way. And if we're doing vegan advocacy or any other work for animals at a conference of conservative politicians, we probably want to dress and act a different way if we want to be as effective as possible. One goal we should have of every conversation and every interaction we have with the public is that when they walk away thinking, you know what, that person is just like me, but they don't eat animals, but they are against fur, or whatever the issue is. The more we get people walking away thinking that, the more likely they will be to adopt the ethics, the attitudes, and most importantly, the behavior that we would like them to hold. By the way, when it comes to targeting different audiences, one other question we should ask ourselves is what audiences are most likely to go vegan or go vegetarian? Some groups are much more likely to make these changes, and so the more we focus our efforts on them, the more likely we will be to change our attitudes, change the behaviors, and spare animals. And so the research shows that women and young people are most likely to move in this direction, so the more we focus our efforts on them, the more effective we'll be, the more animals we will spare. Lastly, showing people how. You know, because we care about animals, we spend so much time talking about why people should go vegan. We spend not nearly as much time telling people how to make the change. We forget that things that are easy to us, because we've done them so many times, are not so easy to people who have never done them before. But it's really important to show people how to make this change. In fact, one large meta-analysis, an analysis of hundreds of studies, found that the most important thing that persuaded people, that got people to make a change, was not whether they wanted to change or thought it was a good thing, but it was when they felt they knew how to make the change. So we need to show people how. We need to show people how to find delicious vegan food. We need to explain to people that vegan eating or vegetarian eating is healthy and how to be healthy, where to get protein from, and so forth. We need to show people, address convenience issues, show people where to buy this food, how to prepare it, and so forth. And also social issues, how to find vegan food when they're out with family and friends. This is important not just for persuading people to move towards being vegan, but also for keeping people staying vegan or staying vegetarian. Because the unfortunate reality right now is for every 4 people who go vegetarian, 3 of them will eventually go back to eating meat. The more we address these how issues, the more time we spend pulling down these barriers, the more effective we'll be at not only creating new vegans and vegetarians, but keeping people in those diets. Last, you only have about 4 minutes left, but I want to finish by talking about our own psychology and how our own attitudes and behaviors can either help or hurt our efforts at helping animals. It can sometimes be difficult to face ourselves and to face our actual motivations for doing the work that we do. Certainly all of us care about animals, and we're here this weekend because we want to help animals. But we probably have some of these more personal motivations as well. Now, these are all, they're a natural, a healthy part of being a human being, but we have to realize that sometimes these personal motivations can conflict with a desire to do what works, to do what is most effective. For example, take a look at these two guys, right? The one on the left is me, by the way, if you were not sure. That was me 10 years ago, obviously me today. It would be great if we lived in a society where people did not judge one another based on appearance. But we know from our own experience, and the research makes perfectly clear, that unfortunately the world we live in, people judge one another very much by appearance. And so study after study after study have shown that the more similar we are to our audience, the more effective we'll be at persuading them to change their behavior and therefore save animals. And for me, it took me a couple years to realize that, my desire to help animals is more important than expressing my individual identity, than taking a stand against looksism and all these things, as negative as it is. I thought about the fact, if my mom was going to be killed, she's going to have her throat slit, and I knew I had a little bit of chance of saving her. And I knew that by just changing the way I dressed or cut my hair, I would be 20, 30, 40% more likely to save her life. Of course, I would do it. So if I would do that for one person, then of course I should do that to be able to save hundreds, thousands of additional animals. Second, in our interactions with other people. When we're having a conversation with the public about these issues, what is going on in the back of our mind? We think if someone stops to talk to us about factory farming and vegan eating, are we thinking, I need to tell this person that they should go veganism and that speciesism is terrible and that going vegan will extend their life by 5 years and the moral thing to do is help animals and millions of baby chicks are ground up alive by the egg industry and animals are confined in these cages so small they can't turn around and the best thing you can do to prevent global warming and help the environment is go vegan and on and on and on. Or, in the back of my mind, am I thinking, who is this person in front of me and what can I say that's going to be most likely to get them to make the changes in their attitudes and, importantly, in their behaviors that is going to save the lives of animals? Those are two different approaches. One is focused on expressing what we believe, what we know, and what we want. That's all coming from us. And the other is focused on it starts from the end goal and starts with the end goal in mind and works back from there. The goal is saving the most animals, doing the most good, and then everything works back from there. Lastly, in our choice of activity, how do we spend our time, money, and energy? Do we work on the campaigns that are fun to us, that we feel most accurately embody our values? Do we work on the campaigns that are in the media right now, or they're popular? Or, do we kind of take a step back and think, what can I do? What campaign, what issue, what approach is actually going to save the most lives and do the most good? We all start with that motivation of wanting to do good for animals. We need to move from there, not just to doing good, but doing the most good. Companies like Coca-Cola and Adidas have a bottom line. Their bottom line is making money. And so every decision they make is made with an eye towards the bottom line. We, as animal advocates, as animal rights advocates, we have a bottom line as well. I would submit to you that our bottom line is two things. It's saving the lives and sparing the suffering of as many animals as possible, numerically as many animals as possible. And so if we truly believe that animals are individuals whose pain matters, whose pleasure matters, whose life matters, whose lives should be treated as equal to ours. If we truly believe they matter, these individuals matter, then we should do the work that's going to save the greatest number of individuals, that's going to spare the greatest number of individuals from a lifetime of suffering. I can't speak to other countries, but in the United States, in the past 6 years, movements against vivisection, fur, help companion animals, for wild animals, against animals in entertainment. If you add up all the good done by all of those movements in the US and all the money spent on those, the number of animals they're sparing per year is under 1 million over the past 6, 7 years. If you look at diet change advocacy in the United States, the number of animals spared per year by those efforts in the last 6 or 7 years, 500 million. 500 million, even though far, far, far less is spent on diet change advocacy compared to all those other issues combined. And it's not because people advocating diet change are smarter, more hardworking, anything like that. It's simply because that is an issue, or as was noted in one of the questions yesterday, that is the issue where each one of us as individuals and as organizations have the ability to, again, spare the greatest number of animals, reduce the greatest amount of animal suffering. So we need to keep all of these issues in mind if we truly care about animals, and we truly want to help them. You know, we all have incredible power. Every one of us in this room, in the course of our lives, we can spare the misery of tens of thousands of animals. We have incredible, incredible power. Our goal as animal advocates, and the ethical imperative we have, and the ethical standard we should hold ourselves to, is using research, using data, using logic, and being focused on the results, using all those things to, again, spare the greatest number of animals, reduce the greatest amount of suffering. That's it for me, aside from questions. For anyone that's interested in these things, interested in learning more about psychology and social change, or interested in learning more about all the studies done on vegetarians and things like that, the Change of Heart book is for sale at the bite back table in the stall area out there. And that Veganomics book is available online. It's not out in print yet, but you can buy it online. There's these little cards about it up here if you want it, and also on the animal quality table. There's a bunch of chapters for free on the website, so if you want to check it out, feel free. So thank you very much. It's been great speaking to you, and thank you for all of the work you're doing. It's an honor to be here and an inspiration to hear about everything you're doing. So thank you.
Okay, so we do have about 5 minutes for question. Does anyone have a question? Oh, over here.
Hi. First of all, I want to start with a joke. How many carnes does it take to change a light bulb?
I don't know.
Oh, it doesn't matter. They just like to stay in the dark. Anyway, Kim Stallwood, yesterday in the early noon, presented a theory that the best change, the biggest good we can do is political involvement, changing legislature and laws and going into politics, going into social change from within the system. Now, first, what is your opinion on that? Because you presented mostly the most effective way to do like interpersonal changes and not global political changes. So what do you think on that? And if you agree to that method, what would you think would be the most effective way? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I do agree with that. I agree that that is extremely important. Hopefully the point I was trying to make was that focusing on farm animals is the area where we can do the most good. And clearly in terms of diet change, we have the ability to spare huge numbers of animals. I mean, the fact that in the US there's 500 million fewer animals being raised and killed on farms each year is probably, is more good than probably any other change that's been made, even though there have been a lot of important legislative, advancements for farm animals in the US. So I think that diet change is one area where we can do a ton of good, especially us as individuals. But I absolutely agree that being politically involved, being politically active, and working to enshrine our values on a political level, and working to achieve whatever protections we can for farm animals and reduce as much suffering as we can on a political level. Not only do I think that does a lot of good on an immediate level, but I think it also gives us much more fertile ground to be promoting veganism. Because if we think about some of this research, and I didn't cover all of it from the book today, but it became very clear to me in researching the book that, again, the more that we as a society embrace a certain value, the more willing we are to continue to embrace it. So the more society protects farm animals, the more willing the public will be not only to continue protecting them, but to be open to the idea of going vegan, because the idea of caring about farm animals is now an accepted idea. And then for the second part of the question, what is the most effective way to do that? So I focus almost exclusively on farm animal issues, so I don't have an informed opinion when it comes to the best legislative advances in terms of vivisection, fur, and other things. So unfortunately, I can't answer on those things. When it comes to farm animals, clearly we're not at and nowhere near a situation where, say, meat could be banned or anything like that. So I think that for the time being, getting policy changes that reduce meat consumption and getting reforms that reduce the suffering of farm animals, again, I think they not only do good in the short term, but they create a world where it's easier to promote veganism and this attitude of animal rights and animal ethics.
So there's one more question. She was a little faster. Thanks.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for your talk. Just a quick question. What's your opinion on humane meat promotion? Like it has been done by quite a few of US organizations like Farm Sanctuary or Mercy for Animals and others. And I think there was an open letter out signed by Peter Singer to Whole Foods Company. So what's your opinion on that?
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question. And I work for Farm Sanctuary, by the way, just as an FYI. So I think it's a common misperception that these groups are promoting that. There are groups in the US that promote quote-unquote happy meat. The Animal Welfare Institute would be one. There's a few others that do as well. But those groups you mentioned, and most of the others that get criticized for it, don't do it. So pretty much every criticism in that regard revolves around a letter co-signed 8 years ago to Whole Foods saying basically, thank you for not buying from the worst of the worst farms. But if you look to the websites, if you look to the materials, the videos, the leaflets, everything distributed by these organizations, none of it is pro-happy meat. In fact, it's all, to the extent it even touches on that, it's opposed to that. So if you pick up Mercy for Animals' vegetarian starter kit, if you pick up Farm Sanctuary literature, all of it specifically addresses that free-range, humane, organic are still cruel, should not be eaten. So that is a common misperception that some of those groups are promoting it. They are definitively not doing so. And what I do at Farm Sanctuary is vegan advocacy. I run basically Farm Sanctuary's vegan advocacy programs. And yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that our organizations should not be actively promoting humane meat. I think inevitably other organizations, stores like Whole Foods, are going to be promoting it because some consumers want it. I don't think we should do it at all. And in the US, at least, all the main groups, like Mercy for Animals, Farm Sanctuary, others, are not doing that. In fact, are doing the opposite.
Maybe it would be time to get another open letter out stating that officially?
I don't know what the benefit of that would be. Basically, the only people who have seen that letter are Whole Foods and animal rights activists. So the public has no perception that Mercy for Animals or Farm Sanctuary supports humane meat. Farm Sanctuary, Mercy for Animals, those groups are reaching millions of people a year with videos, literature, every one of which says that these things are bad. So to the public's mind, it's quite clear where these organizations stand. I know not to all of us as animal rights activists, if we're thinking to that one letter from 8 years ago, but to the public, which is what matters, they clearly have the correct perception.
Thank you, Nick, for this very interesting talk. And thank you for that beautiful feminist picture flexing her muscle, saying, I can dish the meat. As you rightly said that women and children are much more conducive to go meatless. My question is that there is a clear-cut link between feminism and veganism. Is there any specific strategy for men in that regard? So what could influence men particularly? Could you suggest something?
Yeah, what would influence more men to go vegan?
Yes, yes.
That's a good question. So I look at all the research in veganomics, so for a more detailed look, just check that out. The things that come to mind, so there's not a lot. One thing that some of the research suggested was when we're doing vegan advocacy, and some of it is geared towards men, that dispelling the stereotype that vegan men are weak and sickly and not masculine is one way to get more people to go vegan. So for example, in some of the vegan advocacy literature we produced at Farm Sanctuary, when we were putting pictures of men, we included a couple men who were very muscular, like professional athletes and things like that, to help dispel that stereotype. So that was one thing that I've seen in the research. The other thing I've seen in the research, I don't know how useful this is to us as animal advocates, but for men in particular, having friends who are vegan or vegetarian makes them much more likely to also make the change. Now again, I don't know if there's really a practical application of that. Maybe people could think of one, but that's the only other thing I've seen in the literature that speaks to what could possibly be useful.
Okay, so we're out of time for, if there are any more questions, maybe you can talk to Nick outside. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you, Nick, for your
great talk.
Thank you very much.